I say that the Orphan Drug Revolution is a story of miracles, and the passage of the Orphan Drug Act was the first miracle in some ways, because when Henry Waxman started having these hearings, nobody came. Pharma companies were adamantly opposed, and nobody knew about these diseases, and nobody was interested. And by a stroke of luck, the hearings came to the attention of a well-known actor who many of your older listeners will know, named Jack Klugman, who had a television show then called Quincy M.E., Medical Examiner. And Jack Klugman's producer, his brother, had a rare disease. And they heard about this and they thought it was wrong. And bottom line, they filmed 2 episodes of their show, Quincy, focusing on the need for drugs for rare diseases. And Congress was flooded with letters. And it was that outpouring of support from families across the country that actually provided the momentum for the Orphan Drug Act to be passed.
Welcome to another episode of Shared Experiences in Oncology and Rare Diseases, brought to you by myTomorrows. I'm your host, Erin Moriarty Wade. I'm a communications and patient advocacy manager at myTomorrows, and I'm also the mom of a child with a rare disease. Today, we have a fascinating guest whom I was lucky to meet at the recent Global Genes Conference. Jim Geraghty is a widely recognized leader in the rare disease field. He has been a director of 8 NASDAQ-listed biotech companies and the chair of 5. He's worked on orphan drugs for more than 40 years as a strategy consultant, a CEO, a leader of pioneering international operations at Genzyme, and a venture entrepreneur. He holds degrees from Georgetown, Penn, and Yale, and he lives in Boston. Jim is also the author of an excellent new book called Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution. Jim, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure to see you again and to join you with your listeners.
Thank you. So from reading your book, I've learned some very interesting highlights about your career. But for the listeners who haven't read your book yet, tell us a little bit more about your background.
Well, I've been very fortunate, Erin, in my view, to spend those 40 years in the Orphan Drug Revolution. And as I say at one point in the book, I stumbled into it. I was trained as a lawyer, but I started my career in strategy consulting at a firm called Bain & Company in 1981. And I had many different clients across many different industries. But one of them particularly caught my interest and appealed to me. And that was a healthcare company that seemed to have a mission that was beyond, all the clients, of course, were interested in making money and providing a return to their shareholders. But this healthcare company had a very palpable sense of mission, in part because some of its most important products were for treating hemophilia. And this was in the early days, in the early 1980s, 1981, the HIV virus had just been discovered. And as many of your listeners will remember, the hemophilia community was in the process of being decimated by the scourge of so-called tainted blood by hemophilia therapies derived from donated pooled plasma that had been infected with the HIV virus and which then, raced through the hemophilia community. So this company, Baxter, was my client, and they were looking on first how to make the blood supply and blood-derived products safer, but longer term, how to develop products from genetic engineering, recombinant products. My client there was a man named Henry Termeer, who was then a vice president of marketing at Baxter and Hemophilia Group. And Henry, of course, a few years later went on to found Genzyme and invited me to join him. And I spent over 20 years there. And that was really where my roots in this community became, very deep.
Wow, what a wonderful place to start that career. You can't really ask for a better experience than that.
And since then, of course, Genzyme, of course, was acquired a few years ago. Henry, of course, passed away a few years ago, and I've now become a venture investor. I joined a venture fund, Third Rock Ventures, many people in the industry know, and since then serve as an independent director for a variety of companies, most of which, in my view and in my hope, are extending the orphan drug revolution into some new frontiers, into ultra-orphan diseases, into one-time therapies, into underserved countries, or into places where the benefits of these therapies have yet to be realized.
Okay, excellent. There's still a lot of work to do for sure. So we know there are more than 7,000 rare diseases, and an estimated 90% of them don't have an approved treatment option. So there's clearly a lot of need. And I think most of our listeners know that the Orphan Drug Act is a law passed by Congress in 1983 to incentivize companies to develop treatments for rare diseases. Jim, can you tell us a little bit about the history behind the Orphan Drug Act and how that came about?
Well, the foundations of the Orphan Drug Act, came about. Why were they called orphan diseases? And they'd been orphaned by the pharmaceutical industry, by big pharma companies at the time, which didn't see a way to make a profit out of these rare populations. And so a group of parents generally, got together, and they were led initially by a woman named Abby Myers, who's often called the mother of the Orphan Drug Revolution, the founder of the National Organization of Rare Diseases. And the book opens with Abby's story. Abby and her husband had a child who had a rare genetic disease. And there was even a drug on the market, which was pulled from the market. Drug companies refused to try to develop new drugs for it. Abby got together with mothers and parents from children with other rare genetic diseases. They went to Congress. They found a sympathetic congressman in Henry Waxman of California, a very well-known leader in healthcare legislation over the last 40 or 50 years. And Congressman Waxman had a constituent with the same problem. And so he held some hearings, and that was the beginning. But I'll tell you, there's some good stories about it, Erin, that your listeners might enjoy. I say that the Orphan Drug Revolution is a story of miracles, and the passage of the Orphan Drug Act was the first miracle in some ways, because when Henry Waxman started having these hearings, nobody came. Pharma companies were adamantly opposed, and nobody knew about these diseases, and nobody was interested. And by a stroke of luck, the hearings came to the attention of a well-known actor who many of your older listeners will know, named Jack Klugman, who had a television show then called Quincy M.E., Medical Examiner. And Jack Klugman's producer, his brother, had a rare disease. And they heard about this, and they thought it was wrong. And bottom line, they filmed 2 episodes of their show, Quincy, focusing on the need for drugs for rare diseases. And Congress was flooded with letters. And it was that outpouring of support from families across the country that actually provided the momentum for the Orphan Drug Act to be passed.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's hard to imagine that there are that many people living with a situation like that until you kind of see it and understand it. So it's great that you're able to do that. So your book shares a lot of great examples of successes, the hemophilia that you mentioned already, cystic fibrosis, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. How would you describe sort of the overall impact of the Orphan Drug Revolution so far in terms of bringing these treatments to market?
Well, you mentioned some of the great successes, and those are some of the more prevalent, more common genetic diseases that many of your listeners will know. It's also, of course, led to therapies for, by now, dozens and dozens, even a few hundred rare genetic diseases, most of which listeners have never heard of. Most people have never heard of, unless they or a loved one is afflicted by it. It started in many ways with Genzyme, and Genzyme developed therapies starting in the 1980s for diseases. Again, most of your listeners, if they're not in the field, wouldn't know, with diseases like Gaucher disease, Fabry disease, Pompe disease, Niemann-Pick disease, all diseases named after typically 19th century European physicians who discovered them, all of which had no therapy of any kind available whatsoever, and for all of whom there are now therapies that allow children diagnosed with these diseases to live normal, healthy lives. And those are just examples of dozens of others that have also had those same blessings come to pass.
And in terms of sort of the policy mechanism and the financial incentives, would you characterize that as being a success in terms of doing what it set out to do?
I think yes. I think I would for sure. And Henry Waxman, who was responsible for passing many bills over almost 50 years in Congress, described the Orphan Drug legislation, the Orphan Drug Act, as one of the most successful pieces of healthcare legislation ever passed in America. And I think he's right. It provided incentives. It met the need that companies had. There's obviously, companies have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to provide a return on investment. And at the time, these diseases being so rare, many of the drugs, it takes so long to develop them that by the time they come to market, they have no or almost no patent life left. And so companies looked at that and they said, well, how can we ever, get a return if there's no period of what's called market exclusivity? And so the Orphan Drug Act provides several benefits, but the most important economic benefit is a period of market exclusivity that allows companies to recoup their investment and earn a return. And that has been very successful. Today, as you know, many biotechnology companies have turned their attention to rare genetic diseases, and they're among the most important programs being developed in the industry today.
And in the book, you talked a little bit about kind of the many differences between big pharma and the smaller biotechs and kind of the role of innovation. And I'm just wondering, do you think that we'll continue to see sort of the bigger pharma companies buying up the smaller biotechs in the rare disease space?
Yes, I think that will continue to happen, but there are also, many other forms of collaboration. Big pharma, in the early years had a different mindset. They were not interested in these diseases and these drugs at all. But until companies like Genzyme and others proved that they could be successful, not only medically but financially, and so now pharma has come around to being interested. But and there are many different ways, but I would say a very common, probably the most common model, as you suggest, is the early research and much of the innovative drug development is done in biotech companies, which are smaller, more entrepreneurial, more willing to take risks, better able to attract academic scientists, closer to patient organizations, and they often pioneer the development of the therapies. As they prove successful, then pharma companies sometimes acquire the companies, sometimes acquire or license right to the drugs. And obviously, they have the ability to conduct large global clinical trials, which can be very expensive, and that's a valuable contribution. And of course, they have field forces, commercial teams all around the world, and they're very effective in getting these therapies to the patients who need them around the world. So there's a very natural kind of synergistic, collaboration, symbiotic collaboration, you might say, between the biotech companies who develop a lot of the drugs and the pharma companies who end up marketing many of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the things I really liked about the book was how you shared so many personal stories of families, patients, very inspiring examples of people who pushed and didn't take no for an answer and kept going to try to get a treatment for their loved one. Kind of, what do you see as the role of the patient today?
Well, patients drove the orphan drug revolution, and they drive the development of these therapies. The patients, it has to be patient-led. And today, families, and you know this well, of course, are very focused, very aware. There's much more information available. Patients today, parents and families today, they find researchers, they fund researchers, they enroll in early clinical trials and patient registries and ways to provide information about the course of the disease burden. And then they work with companies, biotech companies, to think about how would you design a clinical trial. They work with the FDA to understand what is an appropriate basis for regulatory approval. They work, and they need to work with Congress and legislators to ensure that adequate reimbursement is made available, so that investors will continue to invest in this field. So from start to finish, I would say the orphan drug revolution has been driven and continues to be sustained by patient and family activism.
I think that's an important thing to continue for sure. I'm doing my small part. I'm in a patient advocacy masterclass through Patients Rising right now through the fall semester, and I'm learning a ton and very practical ways to stay involved, be involved as much as we can. So
Sure.
I agree completely. So I think, and there were a few examples in the book where you mentioned families who were kind of, for whatever reason, stuck between being able to access a drug through a clinical trial and before the drug went to market, or were able to access it through compassionate use. Why was that a pathway, or why is that an important pathway in some cases for rare disease patients?
Yeah, the development and approval and launch of a new therapy, as you know, is very complex, and often drugs are moving through development and they're in clinical trials, and there's some indication that they look promising, but they haven't yet received FDA approval, and then the question is what happens in that situation. Often, of course, there's limited supply available in those early days, and supply needs to be prioritized for the trials and the pathway to approval. But sometimes there are cases when the company can get confident that the drug has met all the requirements for approval, but hasn't yet gone through the regulatory, received the regulatory approval, and they can make a therapy available on a sometimes called a compassionate use or an expanded access basis. Those programs have to be very carefully managed, typically, led, guided by outside medical experts to try to ensure that the decision criteria are appropriate. But as you know, again, the reason for the urgency is, many of these diseases are relentlessly and rapidly progressing. And if young children, infants are not treated at a very early age, they could suffer irreversible damage. And then even if they're given a therapy which can be effective, it can't reverse the damage that's already occurred. So companies have to try to be very mindful of trying to get drugs, and the agency regulatory authorities have to be very mindful of trying to be able to make those therapies available to children at the earliest possible time to limit that progressive damage.
Okay, that's a good explanation. Thank you. You talked about a lot throughout the book, a lot of the different major challenges that companies face in the development of orphan drugs, whether it's a goat farm or rabbits or roosters, or there was so many fascinating challenges that we would never even have known about. And toward the end of the book, you gave some kind of lessons learned in terms of policy from the Orphan Drug Revolution. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there are a number of lessons learned, some for entrepreneurs, some, as you say, on the policy side. I think on the policy side, excuse me, a great lesson is that, families can't become complacent. If we become complacent, then, there are forces, that are insurance companies, for example, insurance industry lobbyists who want to limit how much insurance companies have to pay, and they try to restrict access. They're the ones who are always going to Capitol Hill to try to get caps on drug prices. And if drug prices are capped, then there'll be no more innovation, even though what really matters to families is not what you might call the list price of a drug, but it's what their insurance company charges them in terms of copays and deductibles. And so those are the things that families should be attentive to. There's also a very important policy that I talk about in the book that you and many of your listeners will know around newborn screening. And again, given how rapidly some of these diseases can progress, it's very important that we identify them, as early as possible. And newborn screening does identify many diseases in every state, but there are many more that could be added. And there's kind of a conservative mentality among many newborn screening organizations that says a disease shouldn't be added to a newborn screening panel until there's a therapy approved by the FDA. But parents, they say families don't want to know if their child has a genetic disease if there's no treatment available. Well, today, families do want to know because they want to enroll their children in trials and get them in whatever care they can to ensure that they will be able to benefit. So to speed up access and expansion of those newborn screening panels is something that parents in every state can play an important role in trying to support.
That's a good point. Yeah, and I remember there's such a wide discrepancy just between the different states. When I was a healthcare reporter, I did some work on that in Georgia, and Georgia was one of the better states at the time. But it really is kind of the luck of the draw, like where you happen to give birth and where your child is born as to whether or not they'll be screened for, a lot of diseases or not so many. So
exactly.
That's interesting. So let's see, what else did I want to ask you about here? Okay, this is kind of my own selfish bias here because my daughter has a non-genetic rare disease, but it has been amazing to see so many incredible advances in therapies and treatment options for the genetic rare diseases. But I'm just wondering, do you think we'll ever start to see more interest in the non-genetic rare disease therapy development?
Absolutely. I often talk about them as rare genetic diseases because that is the majority. And much of the learning has come out of the study of human genetics and understanding the genetic causes of disease. And there's a very natural, progression in science and medicine when the genetic defect for disease is identified, and then a way to try to treat that disease, either replacing a defective protein or modifying it, is identified. That then leads to a course of therapy. But there's nothing limiting any of this work to diseases that are genetic in origin. And certainly many researchers, many physicians, many companies are looking at trying to develop therapies for diseases that don't have a so-called monogenic cause. Many diseases, of course, have some genetic component, but even if there's a complex combination of genetic and environmental factors, what matters is not whether the disease has a as a clear, simple genetic basis or not. It's whether the underlying causes are well enough understood that a therapy can be developed that can address the root causes of disease. And that's increasingly true of a wide range of diseases.
Okay. And I'm just curious, I know this wasn't a focus in the book, but I'm curious what you think about sort of the role of off-label drugs and the potential for repurposing drugs to treat rare diseases that don't have an approved treatment option. We've seen some really notable examples of that with Dr. David Feigenbaum, who wrote Chasing My Cure, and Doug Lindsay, my Florida friend Candace Lerman. And I think these stories are fascinating, but they also illustrate how this can take a very long time to make happen. What do you think about that potential?
I think it's a very important avenue to pursue. In some ways, of course, if you have an approved drug which has a proven safety record, it's easier to develop in some ways, or there's, let's say, some advantages to developing it. So yes, if someone can show that that really works in treating a rare disease, absolutely, that's a basis for finding new therapies and getting them approved. I will say, there have been some abuses of the Orphan Drug Act, and many people are familiar with the case of Martin Shkreli, who went to prison for his role in jacking up the price of a drug. And sometimes when there are very well established old drugs, sometimes there's no new research done, no new investment made in actually developing or discovering a way that a drug can treat a new disease, but some investor thinks that by taking control of it, they can raise the price dramatically. And those abuses, have cast some negative light on this field. So we need to be thoughtful that what we're all looking for is real, meaningful, even transformational medical value. And when a drug has that kind of value, it doesn't matter whether it comes from genetic discovery or from repurposing an existing drug. It's all about finding true benefit, therapeutic value for patients.
Okay. Yeah, I've kind of run into sort of the opposite problem with that, where one of the physician work group that I work on for my daughter's autoimmune disease, some of the physician researchers have been treating patients with this drug off label for a long time, a biologic, and seeing, tremendous results. And they wanted to try to do a trial to get it so that it would be approved for scleroderma, so that scleroderma would be on the label. And they just couldn't get funding for it. So it was like really sad because they had all this, data and these patients, and it just didn't go anywhere. So it's tricky. It's such a complex space, and so few patients with these diseases. So
yeah, it can be complex. And when a drug can treat multiple different diseases, that often introduces a lot of complexity into the environment in terms of different sizes of populations, different prices, different ages. So each case is, case specific. And I think the best results come when, people talk about the community or the ecosystem. And you've been involved in this, and many parents have been involved in this, is bringing multiple stakeholders together, around a table, and often literally around a table, to sit together and to talk from the scientific perspective, the medical perspective, the industry perspective, the payer perspective, about what is the right approach here, and get all those stakeholders together to try to figure out, how to advance a therapy. And sometimes it takes some creative problem solving, but when all those stakeholders' perspectives are represented, that's usually the best way to find a solution that can actually be implemented.
Okay, that's good advice. Thank you. Let's see, you touched on this a little bit already, but I did want to ask you, because I feel like we can't discuss orphan drugs without mentioning price, because this is something that's often in the news and on people's minds, or in your mailbox if you're like me and you pay for some of these very costly biologics. I guess, what can we learn, or what can you tell us about how can we create policies that will address the issue of cost without hindering innovation and scaring off investors? What have we learned, and what can we do going forward?
That's a fundamental question, absolutely. And I addressed that. The last two chapters of the book, the last section of the book, talks about the challenges ahead and talks about this issue kind of front and center. And I think it's, like many things, it has to be understood in a broader context, right? And so the context here is, the overall level of healthcare spending in America or other countries, but let's just focus on America for the moment, for your listeners. And then the question is, well, what's the cost of drugs as a percentage of healthcare spending? And the fact is that drugs as a percentage of healthcare have not risen over the last 10 to even 20 years. It's been in a roughly a 10 to 12% range. Drugs are 12% of the cost of total healthcare spending. And you say, well, why is that? If we've introduced all of these very expensive new drugs, and people hear these numbers, $250,000, $350,000 a year for some drugs. And the answer is twofold. The first is that each of those drugs treats a very small number of patients. So the aggregate cost in our, multi-trillion-dollar healthcare system is infinitesimal. But the other is what, again, people often lose sight of is the cycle of drug introduction and innovation and then replacement. And as you probably know, many of your listeners know, today, over 90% of all of the prescriptions written in America are for generic drugs. And as you know, when a drug goes generic or goes off patent, the price typically comes down by in the range of 90%. And the reason for that is that the companies that supply the generic drug didn't have to incur all the costs and risks of research into developing the new drug. So they could just make the same chemical much more cheaply. But because all of those drugs have gone off patent every year, drugs that cost the healthcare system $5 and $10 and $20 billion in annual spending go off patent, and that $10 or $20 billion goes back to the healthcare system and can then be respent on these very innovative drugs for these rare diseases. And that's the cycle. So that needs to be maintained. And we need to, companies and biotech companies as well as pharma companies that launch these drugs, we need to be respectful of the generic drug process and the process that, some of your listeners will know about what are called biosimilars, which is more or less a biological equivalent of a generic drug. And we need to respect that when a drug has reached the point where it's lost its market exclusivity, biosimilars need to come on the market, and we need to bring about those same similar price reductions to support, again, the healthcare spending, the reimbursement dollars going back in to supporting innovative drugs.
Yeah, that's a definitely an important one to watch. I'm curious myself to see how that unfolds. Okay, great. Well, let me see. Is there anything else about just sort of the experience of writing the book, or anything about the book that you wanted to share with our listeners?
Well, you touched on a lot of the important points. I think maybe the other thing I would say, which again, well, we talked about the policy, we talked about the kind of the broad benefits of the drugs. The one thing that I wrote the book partially to help people understand those and understand the importance of continuing to maintain support for them. But the other reason I wrote it was just in a way to celebrate the stories of heroes who've helped to create these miracles. And I'm not a scientist or a physician. It's been a privilege for me to work all these years with people who, again, as you know, really are among the best and the brightest, in our generations, and who do amazing work. Physicians, scientists, entrepreneurs, parents, and it's been such a privilege to be able to be a small part of the amazing work they do. And I hope that to be able to continue to be a part of that work. And I wanted readers to understand and know the stories of some of those heroes and the amazing work they've done, and be able to celebrate them. And I hope that if people have a chance to read the book, they'll be able to celebrate some of those along with us.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you did a beautiful job of kind of melding them together. You had the stories of the patients and the families, and then also of the physicians, the scientists, the researchers, the entrepreneurs. And it was wonderful to see kind of the human element of all of those and how they came together working toward finding more treatments for rare diseases. So it's a great accomplishment. And I will put a description in the YouTube description. I'll put a link to the book, but I got mine on Amazon, so I'm sure you can find it there and many other places. But thank you so much for your time and sharing with us today. We really appreciate your time and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you. And anybody who wants to learn more about it, there's a website, orphandrugrevolution.com, where people can find a lot of information or contact me if anybody wants to talk. And I'm always interested in talking with people who are part of this community about the kind of the shared mission that we all work on together.
Okay, perfect. I'll be sure and put that in the description as well then. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you so much to our listeners. Please tune in again next time.
Thank you, Erin.